Death, the great unknown. The point for all of us when the universe simply ends. When will it come? How will it happen? Many of us, whether we realize it or not, have narrowly escaped a certain death at some point in our lives. A bolt of lightning strikes the earth just a few yards from where we're standing. Or the morning we miss our train, there's a head-on collision. At such moments, we are struck by the unfairness and the randomness of life. But sometimes, seemingly against all odds, people cheat death and live to wonder why.
Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. On this program, we'll explore 3 extraordinary stories of people who have survived the impossible. First, a plane crashes during a violent thunderstorm. We'll meet one man who survives while most of the passengers are killed. Then a firefighter trapped in a raging house fire somehow endures, even after her air supply runs out. Finally, the incredible story of a skydiver who withstands a 100-foot plunge to the concrete below after a mid-air collision. People who live through horrendous accidents like these face heartbreaking questions. Why did they survive while others had to die? Were they responsible for their own survival, or were their lives at the mercy of unexplained forces of chance and fate?
It was the 4th of July weekend, 1994, and brutally hot along the eastern seaboard. Paul and Phyllis Calvo, who lived in Columbia, South Carolina, decided to take an impromptu vacation to catch the fireworks in Washington, D.C. It would be a nice break from running their environmental business.
We've been doing without vacations and that kind of thing, struggling to make a business go, and been working very, very hard. And we decided to take a little rest and relaxation.
The Calvos were booked on U.S. Air Flight 1016, departing on July 2nd at 6:10 p.m. with a stopover in Charlotte, North Carolina. Also among the 57 people on the flight were newlyweds Steve and Rita Maddox. They got married that morning and were headed to Florida for a honeymoon cruise. As boarding began, Paul Calvo noticed the plane was less than half full. He asked a flight attendant if he and his wife could change their seats from the rear of the plane so they could have a better view.
So we moved forward. My wife went into the seat before I did, so she went to the window, and then I followed to the aisle seat. I normally do sit by the window, though.
The plane departed Columbia on time and descended into a clear blue early evening sky.
As we flew up, it was not very eventful, smooth flight up, and as we were approaching Charlotte, I could see the clouds, and I remarked to her, gee, looks like we're going to buy rain gear in Washington because it sure is raining here.
In fact, the plane was headed into a severe thunderstorm whose center was directly above the Charlotte-Douglas Airport. Summer storms are common in the Carolinas and are generally manageable. The pilots and air traffic controllers had no way of knowing that something more treacherous was brewing. The thunderstorms were causing an unusual phenomenon known as a microburst, a sharp downdraft that occurs without warning. The control tower cleared the plane to land and directed it to the airport's longest runway, 18 right, on the far edge of the airport, bordering a large empty field.
It was smooth right up until we flew into the dark clouds and the storm. We could see the weather coming, and but once you get inside the storm, it's very violent, and everybody was yelling, and screaming.
The DC-9 pitched and strained against the storm. At the last minute, the pilots aborted the landing. They pulled the plane into a near vertical climb to fight the ferocious winds. Then they tried to turn right to reapproach.
There was an enormous roar of the engines, and like when a plane comes to a takeoff or maybe a landing, when the engines roar the loudest, that's when I knew we were in trouble.
Suddenly, with the engines at full throttle, the right wing of the plane was forced down.
So I could see green in the trees, and I knew we were not landing on the airport. And then the impact came. I can remember holding her hand and ducking my head and peering up the aisle and squeezing tight.
The plane hit the ground and careened into the empty field next to the airport. The main cabin, where Paul and Phyllis Calvo and the newlyweds were seated, struck two large oak trees on the edge of the clearing. Upon impact, the plane burst into flames. Passengers were ripped from their seats. Their belongings flew through the air. At that moment, Paul Calvo's wife was torn from his grasp.
It peeled the skin of the aircraft back and to us, straight to us. And at that time, she was swept backwards.
U.S. Air Flight 1016 crashed at 6:43 p.m. It came to rest on Wallace Neal Road, a residential street just outside the airport. The tail section landed in a heap right on top of a house, and drivers swerved to avoid the wreckage on the road.
I can remember I was upside down, pinned in my seat, still fastened the seatbelt. I could not get out. I could feel the intense heat and hot things burning into my scalp and that kind of thing. But and I lay there. I could hear things inside the plane and things. Then things got kind of quiet, and I listened.
Paul heard some movement, and then nothing, just an eerie silence. Somewhere nearby were Steve and Rita Maddox. Their marriage celebration turned into a nightmare. Some would cheat death. Others would not. On July 2nd, 1994, at 6:43 p.m., U.S. Air Flight 1016 crashed in a thunderstorm just half a mile from the runway at North Carolina's Charlotte Douglas Airport. As the plane skidded, it tore down trees and power lines in its wake. The burning fuselage of the DC-9 finally stopped on a residential street. The tail section landed on top of a house. 57 passengers and crew members were on board. Paul and Phyllis Calvo had been on their way to Washington, D.C. for a 4th of July vacation. They lay trapped in the smoldering wreckage. Paul, still conscious and strapped to his seat, screamed for help. Surrounding him were the bodies of his fellow passengers.
I heard a couple of them move, and then it got deathly quiet. And so all I could do is I listened, and then I just started to scream as hard as I could. And I remember screaming to come help my wife and I, come get us out.
911 operators were being flooded with calls from horrified drivers who had nearly been hit by the wreckage.
Whitlock, do you need police, fire, or medic?
Yes, there's an airplane crash at the airport. We see the fire.
Okay.
And the plane sounded like it was coming in, and the thunder hit real loud, and I saw this huge ball of black smoke come up.
911.
Ma'am, it sounds like it just went down. There's been a big fireball off to the side of the airport.
And is it a big one?
God. I can't tell. A man is laying on the ground. It looks like his whole arm is off.
Within minutes, an airport fire and rescue crew arrived on the scene. Other emergency personnel soon followed. The early evening light illuminated a scene of twisted metal, empty seats, and dead bodies. The concrete in the street was scarred where the plane's landing gear had torn into it. Jet fuel poured from the engines and ignited.
When you arrive on a scene like that, you're thinking, well, this isn't real. And you try to keep that type of mainframe and knowing that you have a job, but when you start seeing the luggage and the shoes and the teddy bears and the clothes, it starts hitting home, saying, man, this is somebody. This is a family member here.
It's not anything that in your worst nightmare you could imagine. You just can't imagine what happens in a major air crash.
For Paul, the moments following the crash felt like an eternity. He struggled unsuccessfully to free himself from his seat.
It seems forever when you're caught and restrained. You can't go and you can't move and you can't help.
As emergency rescuers crept through the remains, they were overwhelmed by the silence.
I think that's when they probably imagined we were all dead in there, burn up and what have you. And then when I yelled, I heard them crank up and they came right to me. I remember them pulling us out and I was yelling to help my wife.
Rescue workers extricated Paul and airlifted him to the nearby Carolinas Medical Center, where he slipped into a coma. His wife, Phyllis, was taken to the same hospital. Rescuers picked through the wreckage round the clock. Authorities soon confirmed that the honeymooners, Steve and Rita Maddox, had been killed.
I mean, how could this happen to somebody on their wedding day? Yeah, and I guess that's one thing I always wonder, what were their last words? Did they know that this was happening? Did they have a chance to say something to each other?
The Maddox's last-minute decision to fly to Charlotte rather than drive, as they normally would have done, had proven to be disastrous. Yet for others, an impulsive choice that weekend had a very different consequence. Across the border in Clemson, South Carolina, Walter and Martha Dunn were visiting their son for the holiday. While watching TV, they learned that a plane had crashed on a house in their neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina. They were shocked when they realized it was their house.
We don't normally go anywhere on holidays because it's traffic, crowded. But my husband on Wednesday wanted to go to the kids, which live in Clemson. I didn't want to go, and I kept thinking, why does he want to go? All of a sudden, he wants to go to Clemson.
The only thing I could have said is, like I said, it's a possibility work of God that we wasn't at home for some reason. We never traveled on holiday, and we did travel.
The Dunn's lives were spared. In fact, no one on the ground was even injured in the crash. But of the 57 people aboard U.S. Air Flight 1016 that evening, 37 were killed. For those who survived, questions lingered as to where and why the line was drawn. Paul Calvo never did have a chance to say goodbye to his wife, Phyllis. 8 days after the crash, on July 10th, he awoke from his coma only to learn that she had died.
The first thing that I really remembered was a doctor saying, son, your life has been drastically changed. And at that point, I realized that maybe she hadn't made it. And indeed, my life had been changed.
Why did Paul Calvo and 19 other passengers survive a plane crash that claimed the lives of so many? The first and most obvious answer is pure chance. But beyond that, there were a series of events that helped decide the ultimate outcome. After a public hearing in September of 1994 and a review that lasted for almost a year, the National Transportation Safety Board determined the probable causes of the crash: a deadly combination of severe weather conditions and human error. They concluded that the plane should never have tried to land at the Charlotte Douglas Airport in the first place.
There are 3 rules for safe flight around a thunderstorm: avoid, avoid, and avoid.
They also determined that the passenger seating positions aboard the plane was the greatest factor determining who lived.
I would say that why someone survived in this accident and another person did not was in large part a factor of where they were sitting within the aircraft, given the impact forces of this, the fuselage part of the aircraft impacting the ground, the trees, how it broke up.
Most of those killed were sitting in the plane's midsection, the part which slammed into the two large trees. The Calvos had moved from the rear to the middle just before takeoff, an arbitrary choice which put them in more danger. The fact that choices like these had such tragic consequences left many survivors asking a simple question. Why had they lived when so many others died?
When a catastrophe occurs to someone, their capacity to make meaning from it, to place it in some kind of larger framework, to see its place in their whole life history is really key to whether or not they can move on with their life.
That moment that my life changed, it just made my senses more acute. It gave me time to sit back and, as I recovered, and said, well, what did you have before? And I looked at it, and what I realized is just how much I had that I probably maybe didn't take as full advantage as I do now.
In many ways, Paul has moved on. He is fully recovered from his injuries and is now remarried. But he still struggles with the randomness of the tragedy that claimed his wife but spared him. Paul usually sat in the window seat, but on this one occasion, his wife slid into the seat before he got there. An ordinary choice with an extraordinary result.
I tried not to ask why, because, they say there's a reason for things to happen, and I never try to question the Lord, about those things, but it's hard not to, ponder over what if this would happen or that would happen. And you just have to feel like it was meant to be.
The world is there. You have to deal with it, and I think ultimately you have less pain, less tragedy if you, to the extent possible, recognize things for what they are and the causes for what they are, and often the lack of cause for what the lack signifies, which is just an accident.
For survivor Paul Calvo, the message he has taken from this tragedy is clear.
We'll all take a plane crash in some form of fashion. It's inevitable. We'll all die. That's the makeup of life. And some quicker than others. But make the most of every minute you can.
Firefighters regularly brave one of nature's deadliest elements to save the lives of others. They depend on their skill and training to carry them safely through a burning house. But sometimes experience isn't enough, and the only thing standing between them and certain death is their physical strength and mental courage. Melanie Stapper made her living as a manual laborer in San Francisco and spent her free time painting and reading. She had always imagined becoming a firefighter, but had never pursued it. One day, she happened to be in the right place at the right time, and her whole life changed. In 1992, a fire started in the home of an elderly couple down the street from where she lived. Before firefighters could even arrive, 31-year-old Melanie tried to break down the couple's front door to rescue them. Within minutes, fire crews took over and eventually pulled the victims to safety. Melanie's strength and bravery were recognized by a fire chief on the scene. He recommended that she consider joining the department.
I knew I could be a firefighter, and I knew I wanted to be, and it was only the fact that this chief of the fire department had put his hand out to me that I knew there was a place for me there.
A year later, in 1993, Melanie passed both the physical and written exams for entrance into the academy. She graduated after 16 weeks of training and knew immediately that she had made the right decision.
All the jobs I had before meant nothing. You know, they didn't change the world or change anybody's life. And I feel like most jobs in the world are like that. But this one, I could have an immediate effect on people and society.
She was assigned to a fire station in San Francisco's Mission District as a probie, or probationary firefighter. But before she could fight her first fire, Melanie's appendix burst, and she had it removed. On her first day back at work, she was detailed for 24 hours to Station 26 in the hills of San Francisco.
I had just come back from the appendix operation that day, and they were trying to send me to a quiet house. So they took me from my station, which was more busy, and put me at this one at Diamond Heights in the hills that was supposedly a quiet station.
But March 9th, 1995 turned out to be anything but quiet. At approximately 1 a.m., a call came in. There was a house fire in progress. Melanie joined 3 others on the truck, including Lieutenant Louis Membretti and firefighter Keith Onishi. Dressed in their basic turnout gear, the 4 opened the doors of the station and drove to the reported fire scene. They were the first at the house. The homeowner met the firefighters in the garage while his wife drove the car out and parked it in the street.
I know that at the beginning we didn't think there was any real big deal because you never think there's a big deal at a fire unless it's a whole building raging. You never know a calamity's going to happen.
One firefighter operated the water pump outside, while Lieutenant Membretti led the way, with Keith Onishi behind him and Melanie bringing up the rear. As the firefighters entered the open garage door, there was little to no clue of a fire at the residence, as there was no smoke or heat or flame in the garage. The firefighters used a laundry rack to try to prop open the door leading from the garage to the house. Without warning, a blast of hot air came from within the house, and Lieutenant Membretti gave the order to retreat from the garage. The firefighters, keeping their eyes on the door leading into the house, retreated backwards through the garage that had, at the time, little smoke or heat. Suddenly, Melanie hit a solid wall. Unbeknownst to the 3 firefighters, the automatic garage door had closed, trapping them inside. After the door closed, the temperature was climbing fast. They had expected to make only a preliminary advance on the fire and were equipped with just the hose and their air packs. With no other recourse, Melanie struggled to lift the door.
I'm like, okay, this is harder to pull up than I thought. And, you know, I'm still have no concept that we are going to be trapped in there because I just felt like there are 3 of us in here. We're really strong. I know how strong I am. We'll just pull until it pops open. And no matter how much I fought, it didn't pop.
As Melanie struggled to open the door, there was a second sudden blast of heat from the interior of the house. As the smoke grew thicker, Melanie lost sight of fellow firefighter Keith Onishi. She kept pulling on the garage door, hoping it would give. Then the unthinkable happened. Her breathing apparatus alarm sounded. She was about to run out of air.
But when that tank runs out, it's very dramatic. It doesn't slow down. It just stops. So you're sucking in air, and then all of a sudden you suck, and there's nothing there.
Her air pack depleted. Melanie removed her mask and attempted in vain to suck air in from under the closed garage door. All the while, the temperature in the garage was now climbing. No one could survive in these conditions for any length of time. Outside the garage, further efforts to fight the fire ensued. Other fire crews had arrived on the scene and quickly moved in place to fight the fire. They didn't realize 3 firefighters were trapped inside until someone heard pounding on the garage door. It was Melanie, desperately trying to get someone's attention as she slowly lost consciousness.
I think anybody who's gotten near death, who's lost consciousness, is certain they're dying because that's your last memory. There's absolutely no knowledge other than that you are dying. It's just this kind of peaceful sleep. But that's only my memory, and that may not even be real. My memory may have been pure terror to the end.
Shortly past 1 a.m. on March 9th, 1995, 3 San Francisco firefighters found themselves trapped in a smoke-filled garage with temperatures rising. Rookie firefighter Melanie Stapper, her air supply depleted, had been forced to tear off her mask. Though she had only minutes left to live, a sense of calm overcame her.
All of a sudden, you're just kind of moving away from life, but you're not scared anymore.
Finally, fire crews broke open the garage door. The first firefighter, Keith Onishi, was pulled out through a broken vent on the side of the garage. Lieutenant Mambretti was found motionless on the floor. Melanie was barely conscious. The 3 injured firefighters were transported to San Francisco General Hospital. Keith Onishi sustained burns to his hands and neck. Louis Mambretti, a 25-year veteran of the department, died an hour after arrival. Melanie was on the brink of death.
The main injury that threatened her life was this severe inhalation injury. She was sort of in a situation where she was hanging on the end of a cliff by her fingernails.
Extensive amounts of soot were found in Melanie's severely burned throat. 2nd and 3rd degree burns covered her body. The level of carbon monoxide in her blood was also extremely high, indicating that her body was deprived of oxygen. MRIs and CAT scans revealed massive brain damage. Doctors and nurses did not expect her to live, and if by chance she did, they were certain she would have no brain function.
The moment she came into the ICU, all of us had our doubts. We see miracles happen every day in our work, and she was one of those we hoped a miracle would happen to.
Doctors decided to take the extreme measure of putting Melanie into a drug-induced coma to help her body heal. During this time, she suffered hallucinations.
The one I found most meaningful was hanging from a rope. Like when you look at the sky, you don't see the end of the sky, right? And I was hanging from a rope where I couldn't see the top end of it, but I was holding onto the rope and screaming to, like, let me up, let me up. And people are saying, no, you have to hold on, you have to hold on. I'm like, no, I can't, I'm not strong enough.
After 2.5 months, Melanie's doctors decided her condition had stabilized enough to revive her from her coma.
I think you have no concept that it's been months and months. And being confused because I was sure I was dead, and then realizing that you're not dead, but where are you and what's going on?
In my entire career, I don't think I've ever seen an injury quite like the one Melanie had. I think the fact that Melanie is alive now is a miracle.
But her survival came at a cost. Over the next few months, she suffered through many life-threatening infections. She had also sustained severe damage to the visual cortex of her brain. This condition, known as cortical blindness, made it impossible for her to see detail of any kind. Her entire world had become one of light, dark, and shadows. 4.5 months later, on July 23, 1995, Melanie was released from San Francisco General Hospital. She endured several months of rehabilitation to learn how to walk again and care for herself as a blind person. She feels she's been relegated to a limbo existence and sometimes wishes she hadn't survived the fire.
I know there were times that I felt like I was supposed to die and I didn't, and I feel like a ghost. There are times I feel like everybody thinks I died and I just forgot that I didn't.
Today, she finds some solace in counseling the families of fellow burn victims and befriending individuals such as Evelyn Austin, who is blind and alone. It's not uncommon for their conversations to turn to the topic of life and death.
You know, Mel, life is so beautiful, but I think passing will be more beautiful.
What does it mean to cheat death when one loses everything that makes life meaningful? Was Melanie Stapper's survival truly remarkable? Investigators say that the fire, which started in an electrical outlet box on the first floor, was especially deadly due to the extreme weather conditions, the layout of the house, and the fact that the garage door malfunctioned. The garage, located on the top floor, acted like a chimney, drawing the hot air and smoke into the house and fanning the flames. When the garage door shut and failed to reopen, the firefighter's fate was sealed.
As the fire and gases went through that building, it was like you stopped up the chimney at the top all of a sudden, and now all those heat and gases were actually churning and creating like a mini firestorm within that building. Unfortunately, we had 3 firefighters at the top of that chimney.
One firefighter died due to smoke inhalation. Of the 2 who lived, Keith Onishi endured severe burns to his hands and damage to his lungs. Melanie suffered burns, blindness, and irreparable brain damage. Her struggle with the mechanically sealed garage door had caused her to run out of air, but got the attention that led to her rescue. Melanie really cheated death twice when she survived the blaze that claimed the life of a 25-year veteran firefighter. By everyone's reckoning, she never should have been able to endure the extreme conditions in the fire itself, let alone the life-threatening injuries she sustained.
I'm sorry, that's really funny.
Doctors believe that Melanie's remarkable survival is due to her physical condition and the superior medical care she received.
One important factor is Melanie herself. She's an incredible person, both physically and mentally. And I think that she's an incredibly strong individual. The second factor is that there were literally hundreds of people here that participated in a team effort 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I wish I could put my finger to one particular event that makes a person survive or not. I think that's the mystery of it. That's the mystery of life.
Melanie's life has been permanently altered by the experience. Her body is covered with burn scars, and she is legally blind. She can no longer pursue her passions of reading, writing, and painting. Trauma therapist Janice Pepito believes that Melanie's ability to stay emotionally healthy depends on whether she embraces her new struggles and finds meaning in an entirely random event.
Life as she knew it just doesn't exist any longer. And that is a death of sorts. Mel is a survivor because she's been a survivor her whole life, and she approaches things in the sense of, I'm going to overcome this.
Skydiving, a sport practiced by almost 1 million people worldwide every year. With each jump, the skydiver challenges common sense and gravity to experience a few seconds of what it's like to fly. Often falling at speeds over 200 miles an hour, the parachutist depends on his wits and a sheet of nylon to cheat death. As Mike Viederman knows, sometimes those things aren't enough.
I'm not doing this as a death-defying sport or anything like that. In fact, it makes me appreciate life a lot more because it's so beautiful. I want to keep skydiving. Every skydiver wants to keep skydiving. There's just something that feels absolutely right and natural.
Mike is an experienced skydiver and a software engineer. In August 1997, he attended the World Freefall Convention at the Municipal Airport in Quincy, Illinois. The 10-day event attracts over 4,000 jumpers every year. It's renowned for its free-spirited atmosphere and unorthodox jumps.
People are doing naked jumps all over the place, off the helicopters out of the 727 jumbo jet, constant planes coming and going. I call it the skydiving Woodstock.
Mike made his first jump at the convention with a group in an inflatable raft. He videotaped the dive with a camera strapped to his helmet. Typically, the more experimental the jump, the greater the risk. This one did not go entirely as planned.
The raft just deflated and it just crumpled up and there were bodies everywhere, and I was just like, oh, they're all above me, this raft is above me, let me get out of here. But it was still a lot of fun.
The next morning, Mike decided to try a jump with two people he'd met only the day before, Al and Lucia.
Al was coming in and he was geeking the camera, but he was kind of sliding backwards, and I can remember thinking to myself, uh-oh, he's gonna hit Lucia.
After a narrow miss and a safe landing, Mike breathed a sigh of relief. He had averted disaster a second time. He didn't question whether his luck would hold when he decided to try another jump with Lucia and Al the same day. That afternoon, their plane climbed to approximately 13,000 feet. There were about 25 passengers on board. Mike, Lucia, and Al were one of the first groups out of the plane. Mike videotaped the others making mid-air maneuvers and mugging for the camera. Thousands of feet above them, another group leapt from the plane. At 2,500 feet, Mike's group released their chutes, but as they floated down to Earth, Mike made a critical mistake. He decided to make a 90-degree turn without checking to see if anyone was above him.
It wasn't a radical turn. I didn't pull my toggles down real hard. It was just a set-up type turn. But part of turning also dives your canopy. The canopy itself will dive down like that. And that probably obscured my vision.
Mike completed his turn and straightened out, just in time to see another diver bearing down on him from above. Before he could react, his parachute or canopy tangled around the other man.
My canopy, 2/3 of it was wrapped around his legs and midsection, but it wasn't wrapped so badly. Once I flung back around, pretty much was released from him.
But his canopy had collapsed. Mike instinctively brought his knees towards his chest and plunged to the concrete almost 100 feet below. His knees struck the ground first, followed by his head. Many witnesses heard the awful sound of Mike's body hitting the runway.
Actually, I felt the ground move, and I was a good 100, maybe 150 feet away from him. I heard people say something sounded like a sack of potatoes when it fell, and as morbid as that may sound, that's exactly what it sounded like.
His face was pretty much bloody. We couldn't really see anything else except for injuries. His legs were definitely broken. I know we knew that there was an arm fracture. That's all you could really see to begin with.
The paramedics, who were stationed just 100 feet away, struggled to establish an airway for Mike. He was barely breathing due to the blood, bone, and teeth which filled his mouth and throat. They rushed him to nearby Blessing Hospital in Quincy and alerted the emergency room to expect a trauma 1, the most severe trauma.
You couldn't see his mouth or face. It was just covered with blood. He had obvious injuries to his legs. He had both femurs that were exposed. I remember him rolling into the room, and he had a 3-inch section of bone that just fell off the gurney onto the floor. So he had some obvious injuries and not so obvious injuries.
Mike was wheeled into the OR by a team of trauma surgeons and specialists. They operated late into the night. By morning, Mike had made an amazing turnaround. His condition had stabilized, though his injuries were extensive. Mike lost 10 pints of blood and 18 teeth, crushed his knees and face, and shattered the bones in both his arms and legs. Remarkably, though, he suffered no internal injuries to his organs. Mike remained in the hospital for 2 weeks before being transported to another one near his home in Houston, Texas. Since arriving back in Houston, he has undergone more than 14 surgeries and suffered through months of physical rehabilitation. Today, Mike has almost no memory of the accident. He is making a slow return to skydiving.
I could never give it up because of all the people. You know, you got the family you're born with, and then you've got your chosen family, the people that you like to hang around with and that you share the most in common with. And I'm very lucky to be alive to enjoy their company.
How did Mike Viederman survive a 100-foot freefall to Earth without a parachute? The majority of skydiving deaths and injuries are due to blunt force trauma to the head or other internal organs. Physicist and occasional skydiver Angela Olinto believes that Mike's mid-air body adjustment to fall feet first and protect his head was a critical factor.
He had time to do some change in body position as the shock was being absorbed, gave him more chances to survive.
The quick response of the on-site and emergency room medical teams also helped keep him alive. But Mike himself feels certain that dumb luck played a part as well. The slightest variation in the way he hit the ground could have killed him instantly. Mike says he has always led a charmed life.
I'm Jewish. My Hebrew name is Baruch Chaim, which translated into English means blessed life. And so if I want to go way back, my parents saved my life by naming me Blessed Life. You know, they saved my life a long time ago.
The urge to explain life's unexpected outcomes is rooted in the human need for stability and the desire to make of one's life a seamless story. As much as people like Mike Viederman may wish to attribute their survival to mystical forces like a divine presence or fate, experts say there is always a rational explanation. Most people will never have to face a major disaster in their lifetime. Yet tragedy is an ever-present possibility, and the odds of surviving one are quantifiable. Some believe the very randomness we fear should be embraced.
Mathematics is kind of our ultimate reality principle. It's our ultimate connection to the real world. And if we ignore magnitudes and probabilities, we do so at our peril, and we kind of, in some sense, become less human.
The fact that human life is finite gives it meaning. Those who appear to cheat death are inevitably seen differently by others, as well as by themselves. Survivors frequently feel they've been given a gift.
You hear about it, but until it happens to you, you can't imagine. But if you never turn the corner, you'll never know what's around that corner. And I don't think we were created to stay in a box.
Mortality, it's really interesting. On one hand, I think death is a great equalizer. You know, you can be pretty, you can be rich, you can be anything, but you're going to die. In a way, we can all be jealous of other people, but at least we know that it's all even in the end.
As sure as we are born, we will die. Occasionally, however, one arrives at a crossroad where death appears imminent and yet somehow manages to survive. On the surface, it may look like nothing more than luck, but there are many intersecting factors at work. Choice, skill, strength of body and spirit all play a hand in determining whether and when one will cheat death.